So I would like to say good morning to everyone. I'm Victoria Main, CEO at Combina Associates. Welcome to our Brussels Calling media debate on tech and COVID-19. Around 5 years ago, we launched the Brussels Calling series with the aim of giving journalists the opportunity to tell the inside story about how they go about their work, and also to help educate people like myself on how to work effectively with journalists. Turning to today's conversation, tech and COVID-19, in some ways, tech, the pandemic has been good it's been tech's big moment for all the reasons that we know. Home working, not to mention as providers of essential services. But on the other hand, in some ways, this crisis may turn out to be a comeuppance for tech, particularly big tech, given the spotlight that it's thrown on our reliance for our lives, our working lives on tech. But I'll leave it to you panelists to discuss whether or not techlash has made a comeback. So meanwhile, I'm delighted to welcome Roberto Viola, who is Director General at the European Commission's DG Connect, and he really doesn't need any introduction here. Roberto is going to be turning the table on our journalist panelists, requiring them for a change, to answer rather than ask questions. What fun that would be. Bringing us an international business newswire perspective, we have Natalia Drozdiak, who covers EU tech policy for Bloomberg and Brussels. A relative newcomer to Brussels is the FT's Javier Espinosa, who covers the busy intersection between tech and competition. No pressure, Javier. Beaming in from London, we have Hadas Gold, who covers European tech for CNN, having arrived from Washington around 2 years ago. One more thing before I hand over to you, Roberto, to drive the debate, to set the scene and to start grilling these journalists. I'd just like to say I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and feeding into the conversation the audience's questions. Actually, there's one final thing, and that is anybody out there, don't hesitate to tweet using the Brussels Calling hashtag. So, Roberto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Good morning, all. And thank you very much to you, to Combina Associates, to give me the occasion of my life. I mean, to be on the other side and to be chairing a panel where we have 3 distinguished guests, which are very much knowledgeable about technology, but they normally ask questions. And normally, I mean, people like me have to give intelligent replies as much as possible. Now, and also sometimes diplomatic replies. Now that the world is upside down, it's a bit our life. So I will definitely use the occasion that you are giving me to be at the other side of the fence and try to ask questions. But I would like to start with a very simple question, just to warm up a little bit. How you are coping with this very strange way of living that we are having. But before really, so I just get prepared for this question, I like to say just a few words of introduction. Normally, when I do something like this, again, on the other side, I would immediately start with a pitch, how digital is important for our life and it's transformational and AI and data and our society and our economy, how they will change very soon. Now, would it be the right start? I mean, it would sound a little bit ridiculous to tell you it's important to be connected online. it would be a bit ridiculous to tell you that without having a good analysis and understanding of data, we will not get out easily of this pandemic. So I think a little bit we have been, witnessing it, especially from being consumers, seeing this revolution, but probably never living into it with such an intensity that we are having now. It's such a strange experience. Our life, our way of interacting with people, our way of working is changing at the speed of light. People that were lazy about using technology, they have to use technology. There's no other chance. So, and we have seen all the beauties, but also all the limitation of this. We have been trying on our side to make sure that everybody could be connected online. As you know, Commissioner Breton called immediately all the major streaming platforms to ask them to reduce the bit rate to allow stability of the network. This was successful. Networks are relatively resilient, although every now and then we all have our frustrating experience in connecting, but considering the scale of what is going on, entire corporation working online, it's rather impressive how much the internet is resilient and is working fine. But still we are monitoring it. We have been using as much as we can data to understand how the pandemic would evolve. Artificial intelligence. We are trying to use artificial intelligence to help doctors in having better prediction, better reading of images, for instance. We are trying to use supercomputers and artificial intelligence to understand the structure of the virus and also to check the virus structure against all known medical compounds. We have been trying to use robotics to help, again, the workload in hospitals. We are trying to, get all the public authorities which have this responsibility to use the same data sets and to use the same models when it comes to modeling. We have been trying to work with all online platforms to have a fairer environment when it comes to informing correctly about the pandemic, when it comes to making sure that unsafe products are not sold, and when it comes to the fact that, there should not be predatory prices on essential things like protective masks. So all this effort, it's, let's say, within the crisis, then there's the new normal, what we will do to exit the crisis. And there the Commission, as you know, presented an ambitious recovery plan, which is directed to inject the necessary resources to actually sustain our economy, sustain our society, and probably try to build a better society for the future. No mystery that this is based on the two transformational axes that the President of the Commission has identified for her mandate. First is in alphabetical order, digital, second green, if you like, green and digital. In reality, they are on equal footing and equally contributing, in our opinion, to the structural change of our society for better. So this is the complex environment that we are in. I'm sure you are very familiar. But before we dive in all this, let me again ask you how you are feeling, how you're coping with this very strange moments we are all living. Natalia, you would like to start?
Sure, I'll start. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Victoria, for organizing this event, and Roberto for agreeing to grill us. I have to say it's a very awkward position. I'm not used to being the ones on your side of the table, so I guess it's teaching us a lesson of how hard your jobs actually are. But yeah, I guess in terms of working from home, there hasn't been a massive disruption. Luckily, we don't have to teach kids, my husband and I, we don't have to teach kids 5th grade science or anything like that. But one of the main disruptions, I would say, to our job is that we don't get to meet people in person, and a lot of this job is focused around running into people at an event and discussing what you overheard at a panel, and So that's, that's been hard. Obviously, we try to stay in touch through video and other calls, but it's not always the same.
Thanks very much. Others, how are you feeling?
Well, it's very interesting to be in the TV world during this time, since obviously we can't go into our studios as normal. And while some correspondents are still doing reports with cameras outside, I myself, I'm actually 7 months pregnant, so I am not participating in those, trying to limit my interaction with colleagues. So instead, a lot of us actually have been just broadcasting from home. Pretty quickly, CNN sent us a lot of equipment, lights, and whatnot for us to be able to do that from home, and we have continued to do so for the past few months. Some anchors are even anchoring their shows from home and have turned parts of their homes into mini studios. We've been CNN is not planning to go back into our offices and our studios at full capacity, at least through the end of the year. And with my baby coming, I will definitely not be coming back into the office through the end of the year. So it's been a very interesting to try to balance that out. And as Talia was saying, so much of our job is seeing people in person. And while you can definitely have phone calls and source calls, things like that, it's no match to running into somebody at an event and that sparking a story or a conversation that you can't really have that natural moment that we do right now. So I'm very much looking forward to when we can go back to those in-person events, because despite the fact that we seem to do everything online and through WhatsApp and text and all that, that is such a major part of being a journalist. This experience has only further affirmed to me what the interpersonal relationships and communications mean for being a reporter and just how important they are to our whole process.
Thank you very much, and all the best to you and
Thank
to
you.
your baby.
Thank you.
So, Javier, how are you feeling?
Yes, I think that, as Hada said, and it's a point that we discussed earlier, the fact of actually being able to ambush people like you at a conference used to be my, favorite trick. And unfortunately, we can't do that even in this setting, in a Zoom call. So it has definitely highlighted how super important it is to just be able to walk up to somebody in the room and, over drinks, even better, because people relax even more. And so that is a major handicap. And as you know, I was only here for like 6 months, just getting in the rhythm of things when everything came to an abrupt sort of halt. Ironically, I wouldn't say that that's the limitation of the technology, but there has been instances where I have been able through, because I went on this massive speed dating, sort of frenetic pace of having as many coffees, lunches, breakfast, dinners, whatever with people, using the network and of the bubble of Brussels to trying to connect to somebody through somebody else. That process has been sort of fast forwarded, because in the past people would be less keen to pick up the phone if they hadn't met you in person. And since we didn't have that ability for so many months, people were willing to even give you their mobile number faster. I didn't have to go on 3 dates to get it. It was I got the number even before I met the person. So that's the flip side on that. And the other thing that I have been thinking a lot about this last few months is that we have a very, I wouldn't say intellectual, but we use our brains. We don't make houses and we don't do anything. Like, our brains are the biggest tool of what we do. And compounded on top of that, the fact that everything has become so intense and concentrated. I have to say that the first few months were quite tough on a personal level. I felt like the oxygen had just been sucked out of everything. But it's great to see that we're going back to some sort of middle way between what it was before and after. And I definitely really dislike the phrase "the new normal," because I don't want to accept that this is what life will be. And so it's maybe just I'm delusional, but I like to just think that it's a transition to better days.
Thank you, Javier. And in a way, it's a feeling of all of us. We want back our normal life, the real normal, not the new normal. Although there might be interesting avenues in terms of teleworking or tele or remote cooperation that still are the positive part of this crisis. Now, this was the easy part, but now really I start to get my kind of inverted comma revenge by asking you a couple of more complicated questions. The first one is about are we as a society getting right, especially in advanced economies, the balance between public and private when we invest in high tech? So if you ask your voice assistants, a search engine, what is the remedy to cure coronavirus? Of course, you can imagine what kind of non-answers you get, but it's normal. If you ask, what should I buy as a pair of shoes? The answer will be very sophisticated and very close probably to your taste. So I think that's normal in a sense that private companies, especially those that are in advertisement or online sales business, they have developed a very sophisticated big data and AI tool, whilst probably public authorities have not lived up to the same pace, and they are rather unprepared to use AI, to use big data for the benefit of all. Do you think that after this crisis, there should be a serious rethink of the private-public balance when it comes to investments in high tech? Natalia, you want to start?
Sure. I'll start. I don't have super well-formed thoughts on this, but I think one area that we've been seeing at Bloomberg and covering startups here is that in times of crisis, they're usually the ones that are, have their funding pulled first. So that would suggest that, a time like this is really the time that public authorities and governments should be the ones to try and step in and support the startups that can help, pull the societies out of crisis. The question is always, to what extent, though? You don't necessarily want to be supporting a failing company, and I guess that's something that the Commission has been grappling with the state aid policies now.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, I definitely think what Talia was saying about the tech startups is really important to keep in mind, is that while we've seen sort of a boom in use of some of these tech giants, and they become, in a sense, even stronger and more important to our daily lives, I do fear that we're going to see a huge decrease and kind of a bust for a lot of these new startups who were trying to get going in these last few months, and what has happened to them. I also think what we often don't think about, but we need to, is about the talent pool, and how and why the best talent who do this type of work tend to go to the big companies because they pay more, because it's more exciting. And so perhaps, again, I'm also not an expert in sort of the private-public partnerships when it comes to governments, but it does seem as though you want to get the best talent to be able to do the most good by perhaps having them in the public sector. And I don't know how you do that in terms of competing with salary, but maybe there's conversations to be had about the private-public partnership in terms of sharing employees somehow, or where the big tech companies would allow some of their employees to have secondments in government or something like that to really help push that forward. Because you're right, we do spend a lot of time and attention on advertising, on the commercial aspect of using these technologies, and of course, science and the public good is a little bit more complicated than trying to recommend, what computer somebody should buy based off of their tastes. But I think there is definitely a lot of opportunity out there to help develop this further. And perhaps while this pandemic has had obviously a lot of negatives to it, I think it has helped us illuminate some really important issues in various sectors of this sort of digital economy that are going to be completely kind of change the vectors that we were on before.
Thank you. Javier.
I think it's very interesting. As part of your question, you were talking about, asking Alexa about the cures for COVID-19. And one thing that we've been sort of rethinking or reassessing. For instance, I did a story on WhatsApp and how, you know, before this crisis, we weren't really thinking in such great detail on how, you know, this sort of messaging tool is now being used to spread misinformation or disinformation. I think that was part of your question about sort of like the rethinking of these tools, and it becomes quite problematic, as I understand it, for policymakers, because if I just go back to the case of WhatsApp, it's a highly private medium. So it's, as somebody was telling me, you know, it's as private as like your mail. No one has the right to interfere on a letter that you receive or an email. But at the same time, it has this society aspect, societal consequences of people spreading potentially dangerous or life-threatening information about where the cure for the virus comes from. And in terms of your debates about whether this is a time to rethink public versus private, I think that part of that question as well comes to trust, regardless of whether funding is public or private. I used to cover, before moving to Brussels, private equity, and I can tell you there's a deep mistrust when it comes to you know, getting investment from these private investors. So I just think that it's just, rather than talking about public versus private, it's more about talking about the distrust that people have, regardless of where the source of funding comes from. And maybe this is a good opportunity for public authorities to step in and show that they can be more transparent, be more helpful. But the problem, as Hadas was saying, is the resources, the talent pool. These people in private enterprises have vast, enormous amount of money, and they can recruit, you know, whoever basically they want. And I see that as a challenge for institutions with limited resources on the public side.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you all. And I think that's why this recovery plan is a unique opportunity, because it's a sensible amount of public resources that can indeed go in the direction of helping startups, helping forge new talents, and creating an ecosystem which is more diverse and vibrant, probably, of the ecosystem we had before the crisis. But your point about trust, in a way, triggers my next question, which is, we as individuals, we have been subject to the ultimate power of a democratic state, which is to deprive people of the liberty to move around and to do things. Normally, this is reserved to criminals, but in time of crisis could be any of us. And it did happen. We got prohibition to move. And in a way, the degree of acceptance of such an extreme prohibition has been relatively high, because people immediately connected with their safety and public health. At the same time, we have seen quite a vibrant debate about the right to privacy. And there we have seen that people are not that keen to compromise on privacy. And probably, and not probably, I definitely rightly so, but then probably it boils to a question of trust, because the same individual might be keen to give personal details, with consent of course, to private entities running platforms, sites that do all sorts of things. When it comes to public authorities, there's much more reluctance to give consent to do certain things, probably because it's trust, it's about transparency. So don't you think that this is a big lesson learned if we want to move on into a kind of space where data can be used as a public good? We should learn about what we have seen during this crisis about privacy. Again, same order, or you want to, let's reverse the order. I mean, let's do something on the reverse order. Xavier, you start first.
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. I mean, having looked into the way that the whole development of these tracing apps started, having looked at it closely at the beginning, because this crisis took us all by surprise, it was a bit chaotic. And so that didn't really inspire to me trust in the tools. You know, if you have two big tech giants pulling in one direction, and then you have a handful of powerful member states pulling in a different direction, and then the EU in the middle trying to kind of like corral and bring everyone on the same page, it appears to be that time and the development and trial and error of these tools is getting there. But on a very personal level, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, just to give you like a little bit of background on I grew up in the 80s in El Salvador during Civil War, where I could do way more than what I could do in the last 3 months in Europe. I definitely wholeheartedly do not want to be locked up again. Definitely is my big wish. But at the same time, I feel like we live in a society that it's, you know, Big Brother on steroids, you know. Not Orwell couldn't have predicted how precisely our way of life would be tracked and monitored with like AI and facial recognition and all the different tools that we have available. So I don't know. It's a conflict for me personally between wanting to have the freedom of movement, which would be enabled if I voluntarily sign up to a tracing app, because it means that you have the data and that you have more visibility, which is amazing. Imagine having had that in the previous pandemic, like, you know, over a century ago. That's amazing in terms of the technology, and potentially would allow us to not revert back to like mid-March. But at the same time, as a citizen, I really don't want to be sort of monitored by necessarily authorities for which I don't have 100% trust. So I don't have the answer, but it's a question for me still.
Yeah, I think that the question of the balance between the trust with the public and what public institutions are trying to do versus private institutions is one that we will never find the answer to. It's something that I think we will continue to grapple with forever, and for good reason. I do think that it's been really interesting to see the adoption rates for things like the tracking apps in different countries. For example, Iceland. Why does Iceland have such a high adoption rate for these apps versus other countries where they're more just required? There's obviously a difference in cultural acceptances of sort of the government into your personal life than in other countries. And I do think, though, that as we've been saying, it all comes down to trust and transparency, and also I think the ability to take action. So if you don't, if you want to know, for example, exactly what data a government or a company has on you, that you have an avenue, which I know we technically have through GDPR, that you would have an avenue to get that, but get that in an easier, quicker way than perhaps we have it now. Because I think when people feel like they have some control, then they're more likely to perhaps trust. Because yes, we are giving lots of data to the Googles and the Facebooks, but I think most people understand that they are giving something up and they are getting something in return. And then they can always, you know, delete the app if they want to later. When it comes to something like a tracking app, if it does come along with, you know, this is your only way to get outside, I think there definitely has to be some sort of tons of transparency, a give and take, and also a way to be able to go back and change it, or to go back and ask for information, just some sort of action that the person then feels like they have some control over the situation and some control over their own data, that I think right now a lot of people don't feel like they have any control over what sort of data, if you're just talking about these tracking apps, they have. And I think people definitely see, and I've seen the changes even in people around me who initially were very resistant to lockdown, initially very resistant to even the human contact tracers who call you up and ask who you've been around. And I think now when they see the actual numbers and the results of that, and they see examples of places where this worked, they're more likely to agree to it. But I definitely think it just goes back to, I mean, listen, we've seen some very harsh criticisms, and I'm sure we'll get into this, of GDPR and how GDPR has done in the past couple years. but I think that could be seen as sort of a starting point to get us to the point where at least there's a little bit more trust. But like I said, I don't think we'll ever find the true answer and the true balance between the trust of the public and the private.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Natalia.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think it's really interesting what you brought up, Roberto, because you are highlighting the fact that there's this conundrum that's come out of the crisis where the tech giants, which have always been, viewed rather skeptically, especially in Europe, are now to some degree almost seen as more privacy protective, particularly with their contact tracing app tool. Privacy experts have said this Google Apple initiative is more privacy protective than some of the government initiatives that we're seeing in France. And I guess the question is, it's almost like, whether EU officials realize that when designing the GDPR that, they had only thought about big tech giants, but wait a second, it actually also applies to the EU as well, in terms of making sure that you're transparent to users about how you use the data and that kind of thing. But, with that being said, I don't necessarily believe that there's distrust in governments and how they use people's data or just listening to authorities in general. I mean, just seeing the amount of the percentage of society that's agreed to stay locked down and in their homes suggests that there is still a degree of trust there. But in terms of data, I guess, maybe there's room for more clarity, more transparency, clear guidelines, clear limits about how that data is being used.
And I think
Thank
just
you
if
very
I
much.
can,
Yes.
one last thought, I think, on the point that this took us by surprise. Now that we're getting more sophisticated with our reaction and we see the data and the tools, and we'd just be interested to see how people were to react if there was a second lockdown, because now we have way more information. At the beginning we were being spoon-fed for a reason. I totally understand, by governments, how long we were going to be in this situation, but now we know. And so if it's like the middle of December and you're told to go inside again, it will be interesting to see whether people would be prepared to do it again.
Yeah, well, let's hope that this will never happen, of course. I would say we will be all much more collectively prepared if things would change, and we hope, all of us, that this will not be the case. And also, I must say, all of this, including the attempt to use smartphones to measure the exposure, came in such a rush, in such a pressure, that it seems now that it's years we are discussing about this, but in reality it's days. I mean, and we are discussing about complex technologies. We are discussing about millions of people that you should use it. We are discussing about the safety, encryption. So these are not simple things to fix in one day. And to me, the fact that the situation is now stabilizing, there are good privacy preserving solutions all over Europe, it's really going in the right direction. Whether this is the ultimate tool, of course, this is for the epidemiologists and for history to know. But the fact that this is an additional weapon we can have against the infection, it's an interesting evolution. More in general, you all remarked privacy applies to public institutions. I cannot agree more. It applies to European institutions, to national governments. And so even more, in a certain sense, of course, equally, but I mean, even more in terms of public duty to be transparent and to be accountable. And again, probably technology helps in this respect, because if more and more we can use technologies like personal data spaces, blockchain, that allow people to understand what's going on and to be in control, things will probably improve. Because one of the things, of course, the feeling not to be in control, it's a feeling that normally with human being creates a lot of anxiety, rightly so again. So I have also hope that the more we are sophisticated in handling data and giving tools for accountability to citizens, the better it will be. But I must say, you're doing extremely well on my shoes. So I'm really thinking to that we should switch permanently, maybe. But Victoria, I hand over to you now. There might be questions coming.
There are not actually any questions coming, but I might take you up quickly on your offer to look a little bit more into the reputation of tech that I alluded to in the introduction, in that is the return of techlash. I'd be interested in the journalists' views. Is that techlash, is it a thing again? Is techlash back, given the spotlight that's been thrown onto its dominance in our lives, our reliance on it? I'll start with Javier, and I'll encourage the audience to ask some questions.
I think as journalists, we first of all would be biased to say yes, because it's good, because it sells newspapers and it keeps us busy. But I was thinking about this today. You know, I've been, again, this is from my very limited short experience writing about this subject, of which I do not claim to be an expert. But it's a mix of, you know, big tech giants. I've been writing about complaints, antitrust complaints, investigations into the mergers and things that they buy. Definitely, I would say that it's right that they should face intense scrutiny and criticism, because they are massive, and because they generate a lot of revenues, and because they touch the lives of pretty much, you know, huge chunks of the population. So definitely, particularly now in light of the pandemic, they should definitely be under way more scrutiny. At the same time, they are allowing us to have this interaction, which I hope maybe it's one of the last ones that we have in this medium, before we all get together for an actual, you know, live discussion. And, you know, I'm personally an avid user of technology. I have 2 iPhones, 2 Macs. I accumulate everything that's Apple. And, you know, I find myself in a weird situation when I have to write about criticism or complaints about the company from which I purchase all these products. So it's a bit weird.
Such is life. Natalia, I was wondering if what's your view on whether or not techlash is back, and if so, whether or not it's justified?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's really ever gone away. You know, just looking at from the regulator side, both in US and Europe, I mean, the competition investigations are ongoing, so it's not like they just threw that out of the window and all is forgotten just because, you know, Amazon is delivering packages faster. I think what the crisis has highlighted are maybe different issues with the platforms that maybe weren't so much in focus before, and that's especially around gig workers and contract workers. I mean, you've seen, you know, Uber drivers and bikers to some degree risk their lives to bring people hot meals, and, you know, the question is whether they're still getting fair compensation from the platforms for that. So, you know, I guess still there.
Great, thank you, Hadas.
I definitely don't think that techlash ever went away, and I think if anything, there's even more of an appetite for it. Partly because, as we've said, we've seen how much these big companies have really dominated our lives, and yes, they've given us many positive things, but also the regulators have gotten a taste of how quickly these companies can respond to their requests when they want to participate. So the request to reduce the quality of streaming at the very beginning, or a work around misinformation, and how, even though it's probably not at the level that regulators want, but how quickly they are actually able, when they want to take down some of the worst instances of misinformation, how to make sure that they're highlighting good information. And granted, it's all kind of minds focused on one task, but I think if anything, the governments are saying, hey, okay, so you can do this when you want to. So why aren't we doing this for all of these other issues? So let's get going on this. And so as a result, I definitely think that The tech companies are recognizing that it's in their benefit, and they've been recognizing this for a few years now, to work directly and closely with the regulators, have those phone calls, with Breton, and have something happen within 24 hours like Netflix did, or like the other streaming platforms did. But I mean, my biggest, I don't know if you could call it a fear, but my biggest concern as we go into the Digital Services Act and we go into all of these new regulations, the Section 230 debate in the United States, is what we've seen before, is the balkanization of the internet. And what's going to happen? How are these platforms going to handle one set of regulations, as we already see it, for example, around hate speech law in certain countries, and the rest of the world? And are we going to start having these walls formed around the internet based off of where you are, which in a sense we already sort of do. Your internet in China, unless you have a VPN, is very different than your internet here. And I don't think obviously the answer to that is sort of global regulations or global rules, but I do think that's something that's so important for regulators to keep in mind while they're creating these new rules that obviously have good intentions to try to make everything safer for all of us. But at the same time, they need to remember how this will affect what the internet looks like in different places around the world down the line.
Thank you. There is a question from the audience, and that is, and it's a good one for you all. During the crisis, are you finding that, that they say big tech companies are more or less open with you than previously in what they're doing and the challenges they're facing? So who would like to leap in there? I think you've unmuted yourself, Javier.
Okay. I have to say, my previous experiences before coming here was private equity, and that was very frustrating because they never talk openly on the record about anything. They're just like reactive and just on the defensive because it's an industry under attack. And I don't find big differences between their approach and the one from the big techs.
Okay. Natalia, do you, is there any difference during the pandemic or?
I haven't noticed a big difference, to be honest. I've been racking my brain, but I think it's more or less the same.
Yeah, I also haven't noticed a huge difference. They're being just as defensive and sometimes closed off. That often frustrates us, but we're used to it now.
Okay, I'm aware, Roberto, that time is marching on, and I'm just going to ask a question of all the panelists of how they feel that the European institutions are communicating during the pandemic, particularly the Commission. How could, if at all, how could you improve?
That was the surprise, Victoria.
I'll unmute myself. Well, first of all, I have to say that I think the spokesperson's team are really very professional. The one thing that's driving me crazy is not knowing what commissioner is taking the lead on what portfolio, because there's so much freaking overlap. So that's one thing. Unfortunately, I think that's out of your hands, Roberto, but that's one thing that's been hard to navigate.
Maybe it's simple. We work as a team. I mean, the whole commission works as a team, especially in this time of crisis. I mean, everyone is really, truly trying to help.
Hadis, do you have any words of advice?
Journalists, I mean, sometimes I agree with Natalia that it can sometimes be a bit of a maze to try to work your way through Brussels, especially being physically outside of Brussels. But I have found the spokespeople to always be very helpful, and we just always love, heads up as much as possible. And it's always better to be straightforward with reporters than not. And usually, if you treat us with trust and respect, we'll treat you back with trust and respect back. And Victoria, I am flagging that. It looks like we have a few more questions in the chat.
We do actually. Alberto, if you have a moment or so longer, I'm not sure. There's one particularly about the view on European technological sovereignty and the potential creation of European champions in light of COVID-19. Maybe Javier will leap to you for this.
My very quick take, since we're running out of time, is that, you know, in the past, Europe tried to create like its own internet, and there's been other attempts to create other things like that. I just don't think that it works at top down from a regulator saying, now, today we're going to create the Google of Europe. I think it has to come from generating incentives so that people on the ground who are passionate about these technologies have the right incentives and want to do things. I mean, you know, I was talking to somebody about ecosystems, I'm going back to the start of our discussion. This epidemic has highlighted how powerful it is to be in the same coffee shop or in the same space to bring up new ideas. So no, I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's great if we could have more Spotifys in Europe, but I just don't think that it's their job of one institution to create them.
Does anybody else have anything to say on that before perhaps, Roberto, you may like to fling one final question? I think we've left Javier answering
yeah,
that
well,
one.
I mean, I can actually build on this. So my definition of sovereignty in inverted comma is that it's a bit like the sovereignty of a family. I think a family should have what is necessary to live, to make independent choices, and to be owning the choices of what to do and what not to do, within limits as always. So Europe is a bit the same. I think it's not an easy position if we want to be, as we are, championing net neutrality, the freedom of the internet, the privacy, all these values, and we are indisputably, I mean, the leading region for this. Well, I mean, frankly, being dependent is not exactly the way to then come to the action. The same applies to value chains. I mean, industrial value chains or ecosystems. I mean, being dependent from others in basic supply makes our economy and society very vulnerable. Now, if the world would be fair and nice and an happy family, then you wonder why you are so, I mean, thinking about this. But unfortunately, I mean, we're seeing that the world is a bit complicated when it comes to tech. It's complicated when it comes to global supply chains. And Europe cannot be in the position to be dependent on issues which are about the fundamental rights of citizens, which are about the fundamental supplies. So it's not about that a group of functionaries of the European Commission will go in a cellar and build a company. I mean, so that would be a miserable fail. It's more about a reflection about the resilience of our economy and society. Would you agree or disagree with this kind of pitch to, let's call it, sovereignty?
Hadas, do you have any views on this?
I definitely see where Roberto is coming from, but kind of going back to what Javier was saying, I do think that it's sometimes these things that can't be forced and they need to come about naturally. And I always find it very interesting to study places where these things have come about naturally, Silicon Valley or certain countries, you know, in Asia or countries like Israel that have really created these sort of tech hubs and see what they did. And it's, I just don't think it's something that you can really force in any way.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quick. I also think, you know, the question was about, in the chat, was about creating European and tech giants. But, you know, we already have European tech giants like ASML, you know, Adyen, these wonderful companies, really successful companies. I guess the focus is always on, are we going to be able to recreate GAFA in Europe? And the answer is most likely no, and we probably don't want to. It's not going to, I mean, given all the problems that those companies have, is that something that we should strive for? Probably not. And to their credit, I think, you know, the EU officials and Roberto as well, I think they've recognized Europe does have an advantage when it comes to B2B companies in particular.
On that positive note, Natalia, thank you for that. Roberto, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to quiz these journalists. I think if you're ever tiring of your day job, I think you could seriously look into journalism.
Likewise.
And it was brilliant. And thanks so much, Natalia, Hadass, and Javier. I know you're busy as well. So it was great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Victoria, and to the wonderful panelists. Thanks very much.
Aren't they? Thank you so much. Bye, and thank you very much to our audience as well.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.